Okay, so some of you have been around for a long time and have seen that we've been doing story time with Loni for a while. But it's been a while since I've done a story time with Loni based on school reading lists. And so I took a poll of a couple of books that I wanted to read in the fall, and the teenagers who voted mostly voted for Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which makes me think you're probably reading it in September and October. And so I said that we would read that, said that we would start it tonight, and it was going to be awesome. And then I realized that I have no idea where my copy is. Like, I thought I had it out, and it has vanished. You know how that happens in your house sometimes. So, but I said I would start reading tonight. So luckily, the Kindle edition of The Scarlet Letter is free because The Scarlet Letter is in public domain. So I'm going to read from the Kindle tonight. Normally I'd show you the cover and all of that, but I can't because it's on my phone. So the way we do this is I read a couple of chapters. I read for about 30, 45 minutes, however many chapters that is. And then we'll pick back up tomorrow night. Unless my dogs get loud or something crazy happens, and then we stop a little early. But that's basically the plan. I don't edit. I mispronounce words all the time. If you were reading this on your own, you could read it way faster because reading out loud takes longer than it does to read it silently in your head. But some of us, it really helps to hear books as we're trying to comprehend them. And I want you to be able to understand this crazy story. It is, I'm going to be honest with you, not one of my favorites. I don't think Hawthorne understood women really well. And so since he decided to create a female main character, she's not as nuanced as I would like her to be. And we don't understand her as much as I would like us to understand her, but here we are. So we're going to start Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter with Chapter 1, The Prison Door. A throng of bearded men in sad-colored garments and gray steeple-crowned hats, intermixed with women, some wearing hoods and others bareheaded, was assembled in front of a wooden edifice, the door of which was heavily timbered with oak and studded with iron spikes. The founders of a new colony, whatever utopia of human virtue and happiness they might originally project, have invariably recognized it among their earliest practical necessities to allot portion of the virgin soil as a cemetery, and another portion as the site of a prison. In accordance with this rule, it may safely be assumed that the forefathers of Boston had built the first prison house somewhere in the vicinity of Cornhill, almost as seasonably as they marked out the first burial ground on Isaac Johnson's lot, and round about his grave, which subsequently became the nucleus of all the congregated sepulchres in an old churchyard of King's Chapel. Certain it is that some 15 or 20 years after the settlement of the town, the wooden jail was already marked with weather stains and other indications of age, which gave it yet a darker aspect to its beetle-browed and gloomy front. The rust and the ponderous ironwork of its oaken door looked more antique than anything in the New World. Like all that pertains to crime, it seemed never to have known a youthful era. Before this ugly edifice, and between it and the wheel track of the street, was a grass plot much overgrown with burdock, pigweed, apple pern, and such unsightly vegetation, which evidently found something congenial in the soil, that had so early born the black flower of civilized society, a prison. But on one side of the portal, and rooted almost at the threshold, was a wild rose bush, covered, in this month of June, with its delicate gems, which might be imagined to offer their fragrance and fragile beauty to the prisoner as he went in, and to the condemned criminal as he came forth to his doom. in token that the deep heart of nature could pity and be kind to him. This rose bush, by strange chance, had been kept alive in history, but whether it had merely survived out of the stern old wilderness, so long after the fall of the gigantic pines and oaks that originally overshadowed it, or whether, as there is fair authority for believing, it had sprung up under the footsteps of the sainted Anne Hutchinson as she entered the prison door, we shall not take upon us to determine. Finding it so directly on the threshold of our narrative, which is now about to issue from the inauspicious portal, we could hardly do otherwise than pluck one of its flowers and present it to the reader. It may serve, let us hope, to symbolize some sweet moral blossom. It may be found along the track or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. Chapter 2, The Marketplace. The grass plot before the jail and prison lane on a certain summer morning, not less than 2 centuries ago, was occupied by a pretty large number of inhabitants of Boston, all with their eyes intently fastened on the iron-clamped oaken door. Amongst any other population, or at a later period in the history of New England, the grim rigidity of that petrified and bearded, there's a weird physiognomies of these good people. Sorry, there was a weird hyphen in that word and it wasn't broken up at a normal place. Of these good people would have augured some awful business in hand. It could have betokened nothing short of the anticipated execution of some noted culprit, on whom the sentence of legal tribunal had been but confirmed the verdict of public sentiment. But in that early severity of the Puritan character, an inference of this kind could not so indubitably be drawn. It might be that the sluggish bondservant or an undutiful child whom his parents had given over to the civil authority was to be corrected at the whipping post. It might be that the antinomian, a Quaker, or another heterodox religionist was to be scourged out of the town, or an idle and vagrant Indian whom the white man's firewater had made riotous in the streets was to be driven with stripes into the shadow of the forest. It might be, too, that a witch, like old Mistress Hibbins, the bitter-tempered widow of the magistrate, was to die upon the gallows. In either case, there was very much the same solemnity of demeanor on the part of the spectators, as befitted a people amongst whom religion and law were almost identical, and in whose character both were so thoroughly infused, that the mildest and severest acts of public discipline were alike made venerable and awful. Mager, indeed, and cold was the sympathy that a transgressor might look for from such bystanders at a scaffold. On the other hand, a penalty which in our days would infer a degree of mocking infamy and ridicule might then have been invested with almost a stern dignity as the punishment of death itself. It was a circumstance to be noted on the summer's morning when our story begins its course that the women, of whom there were several in the crowd, appeared to take a peculiar interest in whatever penal infliction might be expected to ensue. The age had not so much refinement that any sense of impropriety restrained the wearers of petticoats and farthingale from stepping forth into the public ways and wedging their not unsubstantial persons, if occasion were, into the throng nearest to the scaffold at an execution. Morally, as well as materially, there was a coarser fiber in the wives and maidens of old English birth and breeding than in their fair descendants, separated from them by a series of 6 or 7 generations. For throughout the chain of ancestry, every successive mother has transmitted to her child a fainter bloom, a more delicate and briefer beauty, and a slighter physical frame, if not a character of less force and solidity than her own. The women who were now standing about the prison door stood within less than half a century of the period when the man-like Elizabeth had been a not altogether unsuitable representative of the sex. They were her countrywomen, and the beef and ale of their native land with a moral diet did not a whit more refined, entered largely into their composition. The bright morning sun, therefore, shone on broad shoulders and well-developed busts, and on round and ruddy cheeks that had ripened in the far-off island and had hardly yet grown paler and thinner in the atmosphere of New England. There was, moreover, a boldness and rotundity of speech among these matrons, as most of them seem to be, that would startle us at present day, whether in respect to its purport or its volume of tone. "Good wives," said the hard-featured dame of 50, "I tell ye a piece of my mind. It would be greatly for the public behoof if we women, being of mature age and church members in good repute, should have the handling of such malefactrousness as this Hester Prynne. What think ye, gossips? If the hussy stood up for judgment before us 5, that are here now in a knot together, would she come off with such a sentence as the worshipful magistrates have awarded? Marry, I trow not." "People say," said another, "that the Reverend Master Dimmesdale, her godly pastor, takes it very grievously to heart that such a scandal should have come upon his congregation." "The magistrates are God-fearing gentlemen, but merciful overmuch. That is the truth," added a third autumnal matron. "At the very least, they should have put a brand of hot iron on Hester Prynne's forehead." "Madam Hester would have winced at that, I warrant me. But she, the naughty baggage, little will she care what they put upon the bodice of her gown. Why, look you, she may cover it with a brooch, or such like heathenish adornment, and so walk the streets as brave as ever." "Ah, but," interposed more softly a young wife, holding a child by the hand, "let her cover the mark as she will, the pang of it will always be in her heart." "What do we talk of marks and brands, whether on the bodice of her gown or the flesh of her forehead?" cried another female. "The ugliest as well as the most pitiless of these self-constituted judges, this woman, has brought shame upon us all and ought to die. Is there not law for it? Truly there is, both in the scripture and the statute book. Then let the magistrates who have made it of no effect think themselves if their own wives and daughters go astray." "Mercy on us, good wife," exclaimed a man in the crowd. "Is there no virtue in woman, save what springs from a wholesome fear of the gallows?" That is the hardest word yet. Hush now, gossips, for the lock is turning in the prison door, and here comes Mistress Prynne herself. The door of the jail being flung open from within, there appeared, in the first place, like a black shadow emerging into sunshine, and the grim and grisly presence of the town beadle with a sword by his side and his staff of office in his hand. This personage prefigured and represented in his aspect the whole dismal severity of the Puritanic code of law, which it was his business to administer in its final and closest application to the offender. Stretching forth the official staff in his left hand, he laid his right upon the shoulder of a young woman, whom he thus drew forward, until at the threshold of the prison door she repelled him, by an action marked with a natural dignity and force of character, and stepped into the open air, as if by her own free will. She bore in her arms a child, a baby of some 3 months old, who winked and turned aside its little face from the too vivid light of day, because its existence, heretofore, had brought it acquainted with only the gray twilight of a dungeon, or other darksome apartment of the prison. When the young woman, the mother of this child, stood fully revealed before the crowd, it seemed to be her first impulse to clasp the infant closely to her bosom, not so much in an impulse of motherly affection as that she might thereby conceal the certain token which was wrought or fastened into her dress. In a moment, however, wisely judging that one token of her shame would but poorly serve to hide the other, she took the baby on her arm, and with a burning blush and yet a haughty smile, and a glance that would not be abashed, looked around at her townspeople and neighbors. From the breast of her gown, in fine red cloth, surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. It was so artistically done, and with so much fertility and gorgeous luxuriance of fancy, that it had all the effect of a last and fitting decoration to the apparel which she wore, and which was of a splendor in accordance with the taste of the age, but greatly beyond what was allowed by the sumptuary regulations of the colony. The young woman was tall, with a figure of perfect elegance on a large scale. She had dark and abundant hair, so glossy that it threw off sunshine with a gleam, and a face which, besides being beautiful from regularity of feature and richness of complexion, had the impressiveness belonging to a marked brow and deep black eyes. She was ladylike, too, after a manner of feminine gentility of those days, characterized by a certain state and dignity, rather than the delicate, evanescent, and indescribable grace, which is now recognized as its indication. And never had Hester Prynne appeared more ladylike, in the antique interpretation of the term, than as she issued from the prison. Those who had before known her and expected to behold her dimmed and obscured by disastrous cloud were astonished and even startled to perceive how her beauty shone out and made a halo of misfortune and ignominy in which she was enveloped. It may be true that to a sensitive observer there was something exquisitely painful about it. Her attire, which indeed she had wrought for the occasion in prison and had modeled much after her own fancy, seemed to express the attitude of her spirit, the desperate recklessness of her mood by its wild and picturesque peculiarity. But the point which drew all eyes, and as it were transfigured the wearer, so that both men and women who were familiarly acquainted with Hester Prynne were now impressed as if they beheld her for the first time, was the scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. It had the effect of a spell, taking her out of the ordinary relations with humanity and enclosing her in a sphere by herself. She hath good skill at her needle, that's certain, remarked one of the female spectators. But did ever a woman before this brazen hussy contrive such a way of showing it? Why, gossips, what is it but to laugh in the faces of our godly magistrates and make a pride out of what they, worthy gentlemen, meant a punishment? It were well, muttered the most iron-visaged of the old dames, if we stripped Madam Hester's rich gown off her dainty shoulders. And as for the red letter, which she hath stitched so curiously, I'll bestow a rag of mine own rheumatic flannel to make a fitter one. Oh, peace, neighbors, peace, whispered their youngest companion. Do not let her hear you. No stitch in that embroidered letter, but she has felt it in her heart. The grim beetle now made a gesture with his staff. "Make way, good people, make way in the king's name," cried he. "Open a passage, and I promise ye, Mistress Prynne shall be set where man, woman, and child may have a fair sight of her brave apparel, from this time till an hour past meridian. A blessing on the righteous colony of Massachusetts, where iniquity is dragged out into the sunshine. Come along, Madam Hester, and show your scarlet letter in the marketplace." A lane was forthwith opened through the crowd of spectators. Preceded by the beetle and attended by a irregular procession of stern-browed men and unkindly-visaged women, Hester Prynne set towards the place appointed for her punishment. A crowd of eager and curious schoolboys, understanding little of the matter at hand except that it gave them a half-holiday, ran before her progress, turning their heads continually to stare at her face and at the winking baby in her arms, and at the ignominious letter on her breast. It was no great distance in those days from the prison door to the marketplace. Measured by the prisoner's experience, however, it might be reckoned a journey of some length, for, haughty as her demeanor was, she perchance underwent an agony from every footstep of those that thronged to see her, as if her heart had been flung into the street for them all to spurn and trample upon. In our nature, however, there is a provision, alike marvelous and merciful, that the sufferer should never know the intensity of what he endures by its present torture, but chiefly by the pang that rankles after it. With almost a serene deportment, therefore, Hester Prynne passed through this portion of the ordeal and came to a sort of scaffold. At the western extremity of the marketplace, it stood beneath the eaves of Boston's earliest church, and appeared to be a fixture there. In fact, the scaffold constituted a portion of a penal machine, which now, for 2 or 3 generations past, has been merely historical and traditionary among us, but was held in the old time to be effectual an agent in the promotion of good citizenship, as ever was the guillotine among the terrorists of France. It was, in short, the platform of the pillory, and above it rose a framework of the instrument of discipline so fashioned as to confine a human head in its tight grasp and thus hold it up to the public gaze. The very ideal of ignominy was embodied and made manifest of this contrivance of wood and iron. There can be no outrage, methinks, against our common nature, whatever the delinquencies of the individual. No outrage more flagrant than to forbid the culprit to hide his face for shame, as it was the essence of this punishment to do. Desi. In Hester Prynne's instance, however, as not unfrequently in other cases, her sentence bore that she should stand a certain time upon the platform, but without undergoing the gripe about the neck and confinement of the head, the proneness to which was the most devilish characteristic of the ugly engine. Knowing well her part, she ascended a flight of wooden steps, and was thus displayed to the surrounding multitude at about the height of a man's shoulders above the street. Had there been a papist among the crowd of Puritans, he might have seen in this beautiful woman, so picturesque in her attire and mien, and with the infant at her bosom, an object to remind him of the image of divine maternity, which so many illustrious painters have vied with one another to represent. Something which should remind him, indeed, but only by contrast, of the sacred image of sinless motherhood whose infant was to redeem the world. Here, there was a taint of deepest sin in the most sacred quality of human life, working such effect that the world was only the darker for this woman's beauty, and the more lost for the infant that she had borne. The scene was not without a mixture of awe. Sorry about that. She's just going to keep chewing on it. The scene was not without a mixture of awe, such as must always invest the spectacle of guilt and shame in a fellow creature before society shall have grown corrupt enough to smile instead of shuddering at it. The witnesses of Hester Prynne's disgrace had not yet passed beyond their simplicity. They were stern enough to look upon her death, had that been the sentence, without a murmur at its severity, but had none of the heartlessness of another social state, which would find only a theme for jest in an exhibition like the present. Even had there been a disposition to turn the matter into ridicule, it must have been repressed and overpowered by the solemn presence of men no less dignified than the governor, and several of his counselors, a judge, a general, and the ministers of the town, all of whom sat or stood in the balcony of the meeting house looking down upon the platform. When such personages could constitute part of the spectacle without risking the majesty or reverence of rank and office, it was safely to be inferred that the infliction of a legal sentence would have the earnest and effectual meaning. Accordingly, the crowd was somber and grave. The unhappy culprit sustained herself as best a woman might under the heavy weight of 1,000 unrelenting eyes, all fastened upon her and concentrated at her bosom. It was almost intolerable to be borne. Of an impulsive and passionate nature, she had fortified herself to encounter the stings and venomous stabs of public contumely, wreaking itself in every variety of insult. But there was a quality so much more terrible in the solemn mood of the popular mind that she longed rather to behold all those rigid countenances contorted with scornful merriment, and herself the object. Had a roar of laughter burst from the multitude, each man, each woman, each little shrill-voiced child contributing their individual parts, Hester Prynne might have repaid them all with a bitter and disdainful smile. But under the leaden infliction which it was her doom to endure, she felt at moments as if she must needs shriek out with the most full power of her lungs and cast herself from the scaffold down upon the ground, or else go mad at once. Yet there were intervals when the whole scene, in which she was the most conspicuous object, seemed to vanish from her eyes, or at least glimmered indistinctly before them, like a mass of imperfectly shaped and spectral images. Her mind, and especially her memory, were preternaturally active, and kept bringing up the other scenes than this one, roughly hewn street of a little town on the edge of the western wilderness. Other faces then were lowering upon her from beneath the brims of those steeple-crowned hats. Reminiscences, the most trifling and immaterial passages of infancy and school days, sports, childless quarrels, and the little domestic traits of her maiden years came swarming back upon her, intermingled with recollections of whatever was gravest in her subsequent life. One picture precisely as vivid as another, as if all were in similar all were of similar importance, or all alike a play. Possibly, it was an instinctive device in her spirit to relieve itself by the exhibition of these phantasmagoric forms from the cruel weight and the hardness of reality. Be that as it might, the scaffold of the pillory was the point of view that revealed to Hester Prynne the entire track along which she had been treading since her happy infancy. Standing in the miserable eminence, she saw again her native village in Old England, and her paternal home, a decayed house of grey stone with a poverty-stricken aspect, but retaining a half-obliterated shield of arms over its portal, in token of antiqued gentility. She saw her father's face, with its bald brow and reverend white beard, that flowed over the old-fashioned Elizabethan ruff. Her mother's, too, with the look of heedful and anxious love which it always wore in her remembrance, and which, even in her death, had so often laid the impediment of a gentle remonstrance of her daughter's pathway. She saw in her own face, glowing with girlish beauty and illuminating all the interior of the dusky mirror in which she had been wont to gaze at. There she beheld another countenance, of a man well stricken in years, pale, thin, scholar-like visage, with eyes dim and bleared by the lamplight that had served them to pore over many ponderous books. Yet those same bleared optics had a strange penetrating power when it was their owner's purpose to read the human soul. This figure of the study and the cloister, as Hester Prynne's womanly fancy failed not to recall, was slightly deformed, with the left shoulder a trifle higher than the right. Next rose before her memory's picture gallery in intricate and narrow thoroughfares, the tall gray houses, the huge cathedrals, and the public edifices, ancient in date and quaint in architecture, of a continental city, where a new life had awaited her. Still in connection with the misshapen scholar, a new life, but feeding itself on time-worn materials, like a tuft of green moss on a crumbling wall. Lastly, in lieu of the shifting scenes, came back was the rude marketplace of a Puritan settlement, with all the townspeople assembled and leveling their stern regards at Hester Prynne, yes, at herself, who stood upon a scaffold of the pillory, an infant on her arm, and the letter A in scarlet, fantastically embroidered with gold thread upon her bosom. Chapter 3, The Recognition. From this intense consciousness of being the object of severe universal observation, the wearer of the scarlet letter was at length relieved by discerning on the outskirts of the crowd a figure which irresistibly took possession of her thoughts. An Indian, in his native garb, was standing there, but the red men were not so infrequent visitors of the English settlements that one of them would have attracted any notice from Hester Prynne at such a time. Much less would he have excluded all other objects and ideas from her mind. By the Indian's side, and evidently sustaining a companionship with him, stood a white man, clad in a strange disarray of civilized and savage costume. He was small in stature, with furrowed visage, which as yet could hardly be termed aged. There was a remarkable intelligence in his features, as of a person who had so cultivated his mental part that it could not fail to mold the physical to itself, and become manifest so unmistakable tokens. Although by a seemingly careless arrangement of his heterogeneous garb, he had endeavored to conceal or abate the peculiarity It was sufficiently evident to Hester Prynne that one of this man's shoulders rose higher than the other. Again, at the first instant of perceiving that thin visage and the slight deformity of the figure, she pressed her infant to her bosom with so convulsive a force the poor babe uttered another cry of pain, but the mother did not seem to hear it. At this arrival in the marketplace, and some time before she saw him, the stranger had bent his eyes on Hester Prynne. It was carelessly at first, like a man chiefly accustomed to look inward, and to whom external matters are of little value and import, unless they bear relation to something within his mind. Very soon, however, his look became keen and penetrative. Let's try that one more time. And penetrative. A writhing horror twisted itself across his features like a snake gliding swiftly over them and making one little pause with all its wreathed intervolutions in open light. His face darkened with some powerful emotion, which, nevertheless, he so instantaneously controlled by an effort of his will that, save at a single moment, its expression might have passed for calmness. After a brief space, the convulsion grew almost imperceptible and finally subsided into the depths of his nature. When he found the eyes of Hester Prynne fastened on his own and saw that she appeared to recognize him, he slowly and calmly raised his finger, made a gesture with it within the air, and laid it on his lips. Then, touching the shoulder of a townsman who stood next to him, he addressed him in formal and courteous manner. "I pray you, good sir," said he, "who is this woman, and wherefore is she here upon the public shame?" "You must needs be a stranger in this region, friend," answered the townsman, looking curiously at the questioner and his savage companion. "Else you would surely have heard of Mistress Hester Prynne and her evil doings. She hath raised great scandal, I promise you, in godly Master Dimmesdale's church." "You say truly," replied the other. "I am a stranger, and I have been a wanderer sorely against my will. I have met with grievous mishaps by sea and land, and have been long held in bonds among the heathen folk to the southward, and am now brought hither by this Indian to be redeemed out of my captivity. Will it please you, therefore, to tell me of Hester Prynne's, have I her name rightly, of this woman's offences, and what has brought her to yonder scaffold?" "Truly, friend, and methinks it must gladden your heart, after your troubles and sojourn in the wilderness," said the townsman, "to find yourself at length in a land where iniquity is searched out and punished in the sight of rulers and people. As here in our godly New England, yonder woman, sir, you must know, was the wife of a certain learned man, English by birth, who had long dwelt in Amsterdam, whence some good time agone he was minded to cross over and cast his lot with us of the Massachusetts. To this purpose, he sent his wife before him, remaining himself to look after some necessary affairs. Marry, good sir, in some 2 years or less that the woman has been a dweller here in Boston, no tidings have come of this learned gentleman, Master Prynne, and his young wife, look you, being left to her own misguidance." "Aha, I conceive you," said the stranger with a bitter smile. "So learned a man as you speak of should have learned this too in his books, and who, by your favor, sir, may be the father of yonder babe. It is some 3 or 4 months old, I should judge, which Mistress Prynne is holding in her arms." "Of truth, friend, that matter remaineth a riddle, and the Daniel who shall Found it is yet a wanting, answered the townsman. Madam Hester absolutely refuses to speak, and the magistrates have laid their heads together in vain. Peradventure the guilty one stands looking on at this sad spectacle, unknown of man, and forgetting that God sees him. The learned man, observed the stranger, with another smile, should come himself to look into the mystery. It behooves him well if he be still in life, responded the townsman. Now, good sir, our Massachusetts magistrate bethinking themselves that this woman is youthful and fair, and doubtless was strongly tempted to her fall, and that, moreover, as is most likely, her husband may be at the bottom of the sea, they have not been bold to put in force the extremity of our righteous law against her. The penalty thereof is death. But in their great mercy and tenderness of heart, they have doomed Mistress Prynne to stand only a space of 3 hours on the platform of the pillory, and then and thereafter, for the remainder of her natural life, to wear a mark of shame upon her bosom. A wise sentence, remarked the stranger, gravely bowing his head. Thus, she will be a living sermon against sin, until the ignominious letter be engraved upon her tombstone. It irks me, nevertheless, that her partner of this iniquity should not, at least, stand on the scaffold by her side. But he will be known. Oh, he will be known. He will be known. He bowed courteously to the communicative townsman, and whispering a few words to his Indian attendant, they both made their way through the crowd. While this passed, Hester Prynne had been standing on her pedestal, still a fixed gaze towards the stranger, so fixed a gaze that at moments of intense absorption, all other objects in the visible world seemed to vanish, leaving only him and her. Such an interview, perhaps, would have been more terrible than even to meet him as she now did, with the hot midday sun burning on her face and lighting up its shame, the scarlet token of infamy on her breast, with the little sin-born infant in her arms, and with whole people drawn forth as to a festival, staring at the features that should have been seen only in the quiet gleam of the fireside, in the happy shadow of a home, or beneath the matronly veil at church. Dreadful as it was, she was conscious of a shelter in the presence of these 1,000 witnesses. It was better to stand thus, with so many betwixt him and her, than to greet him face to face, they two alone. She fled for refuge, as it were, to the public exposure, and dreaded the moment when its protection should be withdrawn from her. Involved in these thoughts, she scarcely heard the voice behind her until it had repeated her name more than once, in a loud and solemn tone, audible to the whole multitude. Hearken unto me, Hester Prynne, said the voice. It was already to be noticed that directly over the platform on which Hester Prynne stood was a kind of balcony, or open gallery, appended to the meeting house. It was the place whence proclamations were wont to be made amidst an assemblage of magistracy, with all the ceremonial that attended such a public observances in those days. Here to witness this scene which we are describing sat Governor Bellingham himself, with 4 sergeants about his chair bearing halberds as the guard of honor. He wore a dark feather in his hat, a border of embroidery on his cloak, and a black velvet tunic beneath. A gentleman advanced in years, with a hard experience written on his wrinkles. He was not ill-fitted to be the head and representative of the community, which owed its origin and progress and its present state of development not to the impulses of youth, but to the stern and tempered energies of manhood, and the somber satiety of age, accomplishing so much precisely because it imagined and hoped so little. The other eminent characters by whom the chief ruler was surrounded were distinguished by a dignity of mien belonging to a period when the forms of authority were felt to possess the sacredness of divine institutions. They were doubtless good men, just and sage, but out of the whole human family, it would not have been as easy to select the same number of wise and virtuous persons who should be less capable of sitting in judgment on an errant woman's heart and disentangling its mesh of good and evil than the sages of rigid aspect towards whom Hester Prynne now turned her face. She seemed conscious, indeed, that whatever sympathy she might expect to lay the larger, warmer heart of the multitude, for as she lifted her eyes towards the balcony, the unhappy woman grew pale and trembled. The voice which had called her attention was that of the Reverend and familiar and famous John Wilson, the eldest clergyman of Boston, a great scholar, and like most of his contemporaries in his profession, and withal a man of kind and genial spirit. This last attribute, however, had been less carefully developed than his intellectual gifts and was, in truth, a matter of shame than self-congratulation with him. There he stood, with a border of grizzled locks beneath the skull-cap, while his gray eyes, accustomed to the shaded light of his study, were winking, like those of Hester's infant, in the unadulterated sunshine. They looked like a darkly engraved portraits which we see prefixed to old volumes of sermons, and had no more right than one of those portraits would have to step forth, as he now did, and meddle with the question of human guilt, passion, and anguish. Hester Prynne, said the clergyman, I have striven with my young brother here, under whose preaching of the word you have been privileged to sit. Here Mr. Wilson laid his hand on the shoulder of the pale young man beside him. I have sought, I say, to persuade this godly youth that he should deal with you here in the face of heaven and before these wise and upright rulers, and in the hearing of all the people, as touching the vileness and blackness of your sin, knowing your natural temper better than I, he could better judge what arguments to use, whether the tenderness or terror such as might prevail over your hardness and obstinacy, insomuch that you should no longer hide the name of him who tempted you to this grievous fall. But he opposes me with a young man's over softness, albeit wise beyond his years, that it were wronging the very nature of a woman to force her to lay open her heart's secrets in broad daylight and in presence of so great a multitude. Truly, as I sought to convince him, the shame lay in the commission of the sin, and not showing of it forth. What say you to it once again, Brother Dimmesdale? Must it be thou or I that shall deal with this poor sinner's soul? There was a murmur among the dignified and reverend occupants of the balcony, and Governor Bellingham gave an expression to its purport, speaking in an authoritative voice, although tempered with respect towards the youthful clergyman whom he addressed. Good Master Dimmesdale, he said, the responsibility of this woman's soul lies greatly with you. It behooves you, therefore, to exhort her to repentance and to confession, as a proof and consequence thereof. The directness of this appeal drew the eyes of the whole crowd upon the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, a young clergyman who had come from one of the great English universities, bringing all the learning of the age into our wild forest land. His eloquence and religious fervor had already given the earnest of high eminence in his profession. He was a person of very striking aspect, with a white, lofty, and impending brow, large brown melancholy eyes, and a mouth which, unless he forcibly compressed it, was apt to be tremulous, expressing both nervous sensibility and a vast power of self-restraint. Notwithstanding his high native gifts and scholar-like attainments, there was an air about this young minister, an apprehensive, a startled, a half-frightened look, as of a being who felt himself quite astray and a loss in the pathway of human existence, and could only be at ease in some seclusion of his own. Therefore, so far as his duties would permit, he trod in the shadowy bypaths and thus kept to himself, simple and childlike, coming forth, when occasion was, with a freshness and fragrance and dewy purity of thought, which, as many people said, affected them like the speech of an angel. Such was the young man whom the Reverend Mr. Wilson and the governor had introduced so openly to the public notice, bidding him to speak in the hearing of all men to that mystery of a woman's soul, so sacred even if in its pollution. The trying nature of his position drove the blood from his cheeks and made his lips tremulous. "Speak to the woman, my brother," said Mr. Wilson. "It is of a moment to her soul, and therefore, as the worshipful governor says, momentous to thine own. And whose charge hers is? Extort her to confess the truth." Reverend Mr. Dimsdale bent his head in silent prayer, as it seemed, and then came forward. "Hester Prynne," he said, leaning over the balcony and looking down steadfastly into her eyes, "thou hearest what this good man says, and seest the accountability under which I labor. If thou feelest it to be for thy soul's peace, and that thy earthly punishment will be thereby be made more effectual to salvation, I charge thee to speak out the name of thy fellow sinner and fellow sufferer. Be not silent from any mistaken pity and tenderness for him, for believe me, Hester, though he were to step down from a high place and stand there beside thee on thy pedestal of shame, yet better were so than to hide a guilty heart through life. What can thy silence do for him except tempt him, yea, compel him, as it were, to add hypocrisy to sin? Heaven hath granted thee an open ignominy, that thereby thou mayest work out an open triumph over the will within thee, and a sorrow without. Take heed how thou deniest to him who, perchance, hath not the courage to grasp it for himself, the bitter but wholesome cup that is now presented to thy lips. The young pastor's voice was tremulously sweet, rich, deep, and broken. The feeling that it was so evidently manifested rather than the direct purport of the words caused it to vibrate within all hearts and brought the listeners into one accord of sympathy. Even the poor baby at Hester's bosom was affected by the same influence, for it directed its hitherto vacant glance towards Mr. Dimsdale and held up its little arms with a half-pleased, half-plaintive murmur. So powerful seemed the minister's appeal that the people could not believe but that Hester Prynne would speak out the guilty name, or else the guilty one himself, in whatever high or lowly place he stood, would be drawn forth by an inward and inevitable necessity and compelled to ascend to the scaffold. Hester shook her head. "Woman, transgress not beyond the limits of heaven's mercy," cried the Reverend Mr. Wilson more harshly than before. "That little babe hath been gifted with a voice to second and confirm the counsel which thou hast heard. Speak out thy name, that in thy repentance may avail to take the scarlet letter off thy breast." "Never," replied Hester Prynne, looking not at Mr. Wilson, but into the deep and troubled eyes of the younger clergyman. "It is too deeply branded. Ye cannot take it off, and would that I might endure his agony as well as mine." "Speak, woman," said another voice coldly and sternly, proceeding from the crowd about the scaffold. "Speak! Give your child a father." "Who will not speak," answered Hester, turning pale as death, but responding to this voice, which she too surely recognized. "And my child must seek a heavenly father. She shall never know an earthly one." "She will not speak," murmured Mr. Dimsdale, who was leaning over the balcony with his hand upon his heart. He had waited the result of his appeal. He now drew back with long respiration. Wondrous strength and generosity of a woman's heart. She will not speak. Discerning the impracticable state of the poor culprit's mind, the elder clergyman, who had carefully prepared himself for the occasion, addressed the multitude of discourse on sin in all its branches, but with continual reference to the ignominious letter. So forcibly did he dwell upon this symbol for the hour or more during which his periods were rolling over in people's heads, as it was assumed new terrors in their imagination seemed to derive its scarlet hue from the flames of the eternal pit. Hester Prynne, meanwhile, kept her place upon the pedestal of shame, with glazed eyes and an air of weary indifference. She had borne that morning all that nature could endure, and as her temperament was not of the order that escapes from too intense suffering by a swoon, her spirit could only shelter itself beneath a stony crust of insensibility, while the faculties of animal life remained entire. In this state, the voice of the preacher thundered remorselessly, but unavailingly upon her ears. The infant, during the latter portion of her ordeal, pierced the air with its wailings and screams. She strove to hush it mechanically, but seemed scarcely to sympathize with its trouble. With the same hard demeanor, she was led back to prison, and vanished from the public gaze within the iron-clamped portal. It was whispered by those who peered after her that the scarlet letter threw a lurid gleam along the dark passageway of the interior. We'll pick up again tomorrow.